If can you somebody at the podium, can you give a thumbs up if everything's good? Okay, I think that's a thumbs up. Sweet. Oh, there you are too. Okay. All right, this is a little weird. I will try to, I guess just I'll keep my chat box open, so just yell at me if in chat and I'll try to keep an eye on it. Um, but thank you for that presumably nice introduction. And thank you for allowing me to zoom in at 3:30 in the morning and present to you guys. But I am going to be talking about citizen science data and how citizen science data transforms ecological research. And mostly I'm going to be talking about iNaturalist. I know the conference is all on citizen science, so a lot of this will be, um, there's no need for a long introduction, but I want to start with one number, 84,562. It has nothing to do with the time Zoom has failed us as a society, but it is the average number of observations submitted to iNaturalist so far per day so far this year. Right, so that's 84,000 observations, almost 85,000 observations per day. That's about one per second. So there's no question about it. No matter how you look at it, across the globe, iNaturalist is kind of reshaping how we think about ecological and biodiversity research. So I assume or hope that most of you in the audience are familiar with iNaturalist, but I did not want to make that assumption. And so I'm going to give a brief overview of what iNaturalist is, a little bit about the data that we get from it, and then I'll jump into kind of like how that's actually transforming biodiversity and ecological research. So with iNaturalist, there's two ways to document organisms: photos, which is overwhelmingly the majority of ways that people contribute observations, and recordings. So you take this photo or recording, you use a smartphone or the website, and you upload it to the internet. The first step is a very large, probably one of the largest computer vision models, AI models that exists right now. And it gives you a suggested identification. It'll tell you like, hey, we're pretty sure it's in this genus, but also we think it might be this species. And then you're able to click and kind of see what you think and agree or disagree, and then label that as a species. But one of the most important things about our naturalists that I think is often glossed over is that humans are 100% in the loop. Humans need to confirm and identify these observations and, agree or disagree with that computer vision model, that which in theory makes the computer vision model even better when it has better human validated training data that it's being built on. And so as a scientist, we get three key pieces of data from iNaturalist: what, where, when, right? So what is it, where is it, and when is it there? I'm going to just go through these very briefly. So what is it is our taxonomic resolution. You can label anything from, life all the way down to a species level. If you're not sure, you can go family, genus, etc., or even birds, yeah, so anything is useful. But more than 550,000 species have been submitted to iNaturalist so far. Here is one of my observations. This is a southern skipperling, and it is on a Biden's elbow, but I'm biased towards animals, and so I'm interested in the southern skipperling. And so, where is it? It's in my backyard in Plantation, Florida, not too far from Fort Lauderdale, not too far from Miami. If you're ever in this area, this is where I live. Feel free to stop in. That'd be pretty cool if somebody took me up on that one day. And if you zoom out, every red box is an observation of the southern skipperling, right? So you can see these different observations, in Broward County. If you're a naturalist in the room, you're probably like, oh, he chose that because this is like a weird brag because it's a really good backyard butterfly, and that would be accurate, right? They're just really uncommon, but you can zoom out a little bit further, and then really quickly you can see its entire geographic range. It's a southeastern United States species into Mexico, Texas, Florida. In general, it's the southeast United States. And then when is it there? This is a phenogram. You have month on the x-axis and the number of observations on the y-axis. And again, really quickly, you can see that this is a fall flying here in the US. This is a fall flying species, right? The peak number of observations is in the fall. Now, granted, this doesn't take into account the geographic variability that, would exist within the species range, but still, nevertheless, really quickly, you can glean some really important information. The other key piece of information that you really need to be familiar with on iNaturalist is what's called research grade. Research grade is somewhat self-explanatory, but it is the data that researchers should be using or at least strive to use. And research grade is met when an observation goes through that human validation process and two-thirds agreement, at least two-thirds agreement is reached on the species identification. And all research grade observations, depending on the licensing, which is complex and I won't get into that, are sent to the GBIF platform roughly bi-weekly. And the other important piece of information that an observation needs to reach research grade is metadata, right? Metadata is the data about the data. And so you need to make sure you have very consistent metadata. But here's a list of the research grade qualifications: the date, location. Obviously, you need evidence of an organism. That's that photo or recording. A wild organism. A lot of people put animals from zoos on iNaturalist, which do not count for research grade status. Accurate date, accurate location. All these things need to be kind of ticked and are validated by the community of naturalists online to make sure that it, looks good, thumbs up, and is able to meet that research grade status. So that's just a very brief kind of like speedy overview of what iNaturalist is and what the data consists of. I want to talk about how researchers are using this data. There's lots of stories out there and anecdotal pieces of research that have been published, and you guys are probably familiar with some of them, right? The rediscovery of this Oriental blue clearwing in Sumatra, right? Like lots of like these rediscoveries. Here we show that high quality photographic records can be used to identify a poorly known and rarely seen species of moth using iNaturalist in the field. Another one, somebody was hiking in China and a local, person in China, they took a photo of this, what they thought was a bee, uploaded it to iNaturalist. You can see here lots of comments back and forth, but it turns out that was a new species to science that was described, right? Based on the specimen collected in 2013 from that person that found it and these new images posted to iNaturalist, they described this new bee mimicking stiletto fly. Researchers are also using it to understand color, like biological mechanisms like Malheur stripe in peregrine falcons. And then they're combining iNaturalist with massive plant trait databases like the TRI database to map ecological traits globally through space using that occurrence records from iNaturalist plus the trait database that exists that is linked to every species that we're able to get from iNaturalist. And I could go on and on and on with all these different anecdotal kind of tidbits of how iNaturalist data are being used in the scientific literature. And, as someone who contributes to iNaturalist too much, potentially, if you ask my wife, and also contributes to it, from a research perspective and uses the data and publishes papers of the data, I'm very familiar with these types of work. But I've been really interested in what this looks like at a really large scale. And so my research group undertook a quantitative look at iNaturalist data usage, right? We were really keen to understand across ecology and biodiversity research how our published iNaturalist work's being, conducted. And I'll drop the paper right up front. This is titled iNaturalist Accelerates Biodiversity Research. It was published late last year at Bioscience. And in order to do this, luckily, iNaturalist is a somewhat unique term. Naturalist not so much, but iNaturalist, yes. So we typed that into Google Scholar, Scopus, Web of Science. I remember when we first typed it into Google Scholar, there was over 11,000 hits, and I'm like, oh gosh, like this is why nobody's like written this paper yet. But we plugged on. We screened articles. They had to be peer review, written in English or Spanish. Use iNaturalist data or a review of iNaturalist. We whittled that down, went through a bunch of abstracts. We ended up with just over 2,000 articles that we manually tagged. And by manually tagged, I mean we extracted this information from them, the study area, topic, taxonomy, and then how the data are being used, what types of analyses, how much iNaturalist data is being used in the paper. Is it the main data source or is it just a little minor data source? And the article topics that we started out with about 16 of these, and we quickly realized that was going to be way too much work. And so we whittled it down to 8. But species distribution / range dynamics, biology, behavior, biodiversity, meaning like community ecology, multiple species at the same time, climate change, species discovery, that's kind of like this new species described as science or rediscovery of a species that hasn't been seen in a long time, and then education and community engagement. In addition to using this manual approach, we also did a supplemental analysis from GBIF because when people use GBIF and cite the DOI, it's automatically tagged with the data set that it comes from. In this case, iNaturalist, we were able to write some code and kind of understand that as well. Overall, across all these articles, these two different approaches, we found that only 10% actually aligned. So it's like kind of good that we did both methodological approaches to understand what was going on with iNaturalist data. And here's like, I guess, kind of the main takeaway in one slide. Here on the right in the green, you have the number of iNaturalist observations in millions through time. You can see this just very, very steep increase. And then you have the number of iNaturalist articles and the number of iNaturalist articles using the GBIF method that are being published. And you can see these trends just very closely mirroring the number of observations through time. iNaturalist data is used in research from 128 countries. So that means that not necessarily the researchers themselves, but the observations itself from 128 different countries have been used to be published on in the scientific literature. And importantly, we did some analysis to show like kind of the over and under importance of iNaturalist data, given the number of iNaturalist observations. And you'll see largely in the global south, in parts of Africa, Asia, Southeast Asia, it's actually more important, right? That means that there's more articles published per number of iNaturalist observations, showing this like really important data set, especially in places like the global south where there hasn't been a historical kind of ecological monitoring program. 638 taxonomic families were represented in our analysis. Insects had the highest number of articles, followed by plants, mammals, and then birds. I think it makes sense that birds is a little bit down the list, which is unusual to see, but it's because eBird exists, and so most people publishing on birds and citizen science are probably going to go straight to eBird. And so, this just illustrates those 638 families, just illustrates how taxonomically pervasive iNaturalist data are being used in the literature is. And then just over 50% of articles were focused on 3 or fewer species. And so, that shows that kind of like very narrow taxonomic focus, this level of species that are frequently being used. And we took all the articles that we looked at and we put the titles into a word cloud. And so the size of the word is proportional to the number of times it appears in the titles. And so distribution, climate change, citizen science, potential, new, conservation are all kind of like overrepresented. And that actually tracked pretty well with our manual analysis of the articles. By and large, species distribution and range dynamics was the #1 use of iNaturalist data. So that's like your classic example of this is a new species for Israel or whatever it might be that has never been seen in usually a geopolitical region or this, stuff like that. Followed by biology, biodiversity, and then, still like species discovery. These are new species. They're still a non-zero number, and quite a few species discovery articles are being published using iNaturalist. And here, I want to start over here. For just over 250, iNaturalist was the main data role, meaning that like the whole paper basically used iNaturalist data, but the majority, it was the minor data source. And so what's becoming increasingly common is people are still conducting scientific research in the same way, using the same data sets, but they're adding in that iNaturalist data, right? That's giving them like geographic, spatial kind of like scale that they haven't had before to add context to their study. And then, it's still a major data source for quite a few as well. Analyses conducted, species distribution was the top, species distribution modeling was the top one, descriptive second, image analysis, different measures, and then reviews. And really interestingly, I showed you that picture of a southern skipperling, but it was on a Biden's elbow, right? And so that's an example of an interaction. From one photo, you know this interaction of this plant pollinator interaction. And increasingly, although I said the what, where, when was kind of those like key pieces of information, scientists are increasingly using the photos themselves to extract information, whether it's like black morphs of gray squirrels, plant pollinator interactions, timing of antlers and deer, all sorts of examples. What you can see through time, the proportion of data types that are using the imagery itself is increasing. And this is what we call secondary data. It's data that isn't necessarily that like main point of why it was uploaded, but it's really important, and scientists are, increasingly leveraging these data. Overall, we found over 5,000 publications that used iNaturalist data. In the last 5 years, there was a tenfold increase. And in 2022, about 4 articles were published per day using iNaturalist data. Unfortunately, it took us a long time to go through all these articles, and so this like is slightly outdated. We did some back of the envelope calculations, and we estimate between 8 and 9 papers per day were published in 2025 using iNaturalist data. But the most important point is it's just completely pervasive, right? Geographically, 128 countries, taxonomically, 638 different families. It's being used across the entire tree of life, and I think that's really important. So now I'm going to switch gears to a different example. And I do apologize. This is very US centric, but it leads to a very important point, and I hope that it is relevant for you all. But I was really interested in how these data are being used in policy. So, I just talked about research. We know it's being used, obviously, but we conducted this review. But what about in policy? And like making on the ground decisions for biodiversity conservation and mitigation. Here we have a very quite strict permitting process. It's the United States National Environmental Policy Act. It involves science and the public and federal decision making. But there are 3 levels under this NEPA: environmental impact statements, environmental assessment, and categorical exclusion. So I assume you have some sort of environmental permitting that takes place there, and this would be very similar to that. Essentially, what happens is anything that is going to take place on federal land, it could be full-on resource extraction and mining, all the way to widening a bridge, right? Like that's in a national park. Anything on federal land has to go through this permitting process, and it has to undergo an environmental impact assessment. So an environmental impact statement needs to be made. And so there's lots and lots of these that take place. And our question was, are citizen science data being used in this, very important environmental review process? We searched a database of all these environmental impact statements from 2012 to 2022 using 4 keywords: citizen science, community science, eBird, and iNaturalist. So we searched over 1,300 documents, of which 228 returned a hit and were used in this study. It's across the whole US. These are being used. Some states have like stricter permitting regulations, like California. And so you see this like, higher number of documents that were returned from different places in different parts of the US. Across 45 different agencies in the US, right? So here's a lot of our federal agencies that were, the authors or the receivers of a given environmental impact statement. And for each one of these 228 documents, we manually, qualitatively, quantitatively coded them. We coded them in one of 4 ways: nondescript. And so we just weren't really sure how citizen science data were being used in that environmental impact statement. They might have said, oh, programs are offered like an iNaturalist walk, right? That's an example. Suggested. Citizen science methods are encouraged or recommended to like bridge a data gap. So we're going to undergo this, whatever it might be. But we suggest using citizen science platform, eBird or iNaturalist, as a monitoring tool in the future to see if it has any impact on, the landscape analysis area. Indirect is this, it's not really relevant, but they do use eBird or iNaturalist or citizen science. So red knot is generally restricted to ocean coasts during winter and occurs primarily along the coast during migration. Cite eBird. this doesn't really have any bearing on the actual environmental impact of that thing that's about to take place, but it was cited, so it's not necessarily of interest. The one that we are most interested in is this direct usage of citizen science, community science, iNaturalist, eBird. So citizen science methods were directly applied to identify species of interest in the environmental impact statement. In other words, it's being used to make an informed decision or implication of that species' presence or absence within that area that is, again, undergoing that widening bridge, like the minor case, to a new road being developed, to, a mine being expanded, whatever it might be. Here's an example. In eBird, there are 687 records of 969 individuals on the Inyo National Forest. Through time, and this was like actually kind of, interesting to see because I didn't know what the answer was going to be, but from 2012 to 2022, there's a really steep increase in the number of these environmental impact statements that are at least mentioning or using citizen science data. In 2022, over 40% of all environmental impact statements published are using or mentioning citizen science data. This is actually I was pretty surprised by this. This seems like a lot. And here's by the numbers. 64% are using it in this direct way, 19% indirect, 4%, we didn't really matter, nondescript, and then 20% are suggesting. Those are not necessarily mutually exclusive. Now down here, I said I was talking about iNaturalist, but eBird is a heavily dominant source here. 87% of them used eBird and 6% used iNaturalist. I think that reflects two things. One, in the US, we have a pretty strong bias towards vertebrate species in our threatened and endangered species list and act, the species that kind of matter for these environmental impact statements. And so it makes sense that eBird is kind of used a little bit more often. But also iNaturalist is kind of the new kid on the block. And so I think that this will increase through time as we go further. Now, here's where I know this is a little bit US centric, but here's where I think it is really important no matter where you are. This is a direct quote from one of the environmental impact statements. No records of Arkansas river shiner have been submitted to iNaturalist from within or close to the landscape analysis area. In other words, they're saying this species of interest that we need to think about and account for, and from a permitting regulation perspective, hasn't been seen in the landscape analysis area through iNaturalist. However, if you go to iNaturalist, there's only one observation of Arkansas river shiner on all of iNaturalist, right? And so this actually was more prevalent than I had imagined. 12% of all environmental impact statements use no citing of a species as evidence of absence of that species, right? So without any statistical detectability accounting or statistical inference, they're saying this species wasn't seen, therefore it doesn't exist, and we're going to use this knowledge to potentially, make a decision about that environmental regulation. This is obviously problematic. And I don't think anything is necessarily ill-intentioned, but I think it's really important to understand how the data are used. And, but all in all, this paper, we really wanted to just highlight this idea of using citizen science data in environmental policy and environmental review. I think it is really worthy of future discussion. Even myself, I'm hardcore iNatter. You tell me that one of my favorite green spaces is going to be developed into a condominium. I'm like there, ready to BioBlitz and ready to see as much as I possibly can. But then I'm like, oh, but I submit all this observations, and then someone could literally, a consulting company could come in, use all those observations, write a report, and make a pretty dollar on that. So I get a little bit conflicted. And so I think thinking about how participants are willing to contribute their data in this way is really important. And then also, as I just said, ensuring your conclusions are scientifically sound, appropriate statistical analysis is super important going forward. And here's a QR code for that paper, but it really just kind of highlights that the citizen science is definitely a valuable tool for environmental review, but we need to be careful about how we use it. Those two pieces, in my opinion, are really showing how participatory citizen science, and iNaturalist in particular, is just absolutely reshaping ecological research. it's kind of crazy. 4 articles a day in 2022 are published using naturalist data. So we went from 10 years ago barely existing to a fundamental linchpin of ecology research. And so I think the next thing that I'm just, that I'm working on right now, and this is still new, and so I hope don't tweet or anything if people still use Twitter. But like, what does the future entail? This is from this like waves of innovation theory. And so, I think secondary data we're already doing. We're like currently researchers are currently doing that. Data integration, I think, is really key. Using all the data sources available, including iNaturalist, and kind of like expanding the statistical inference that we have. But I think trend detection using iNaturalist and these presence-only data sets, there's a lot of statistical hurdles to overcome, but I do think it is possible in the not so distant future. So I think that's something that my research group and many other research groups are kind of working towards holistically. But I just wanted to end on a few key considerations when using iNaturalist data for scientific research. Again, this is a work in progress, but we kind of break this down into 4 different groups: understand the data itself, acquire the data, analyze the data appropriately, and then make that reproducible. Um, you know, in one regard, it seems easy. iNaturalist is a presence-only citizen science data set, but there's so many idiosyncrasies when you have this like massive data set with 85,000 observations submitted per day and growing rapidly, that in order to use that meaningfully, you have to be pretty well versed in it. Right? So knowing that there's differences between the iNaturalist taxonomic tree and the GBIF taxonomic backbone. The fact that iNaturalist is a living data set. Anybody could go in and delete their observations. The identifications can change. Even something that's research grade can be knocked backwards if, the correct expert comes in and says, actually, that's not this. This is this other species that looks very similar. Or we can't ID that species without dissection and or whatever the case might be. Understanding location accuracy, radius of the location accuracy in meters must be considered when using data and analysis. There's a lot of geoprivacy because there's a lot of users that use iNaturalist but don't want their address posted in the conference talk like I do. And so, obscured locations are randomly placed in a 0.2 degree by 0.2 degree grid cell, so knowing how to account for that. And then there's multiple ways to get iNaturalist data. And so acquiring it, you have species identity, location, and date. GBIF is the number one way that, we recommend getting iNaturalist data if it suits your use case. However, there is an API that you can use. There's an export tool. But the beauty of GBIF is it comes with a DOI. And so that like search string in that data set is archived. And so it helps with that reproducibility part. But there's also many different things like data summaries that can be obtained from the API. There's a growing, obviously, I talked about this imagery use. There's lots of photographs and sounds that can be used. The URLs can be obtained and those can be downloaded. There's range maps that can be downloaded, data and identifications to understand kind of that human nature interaction that takes place. There's lots of data there that is available. And so just knowing the types of data that you can get from iNaturalist is really important in using that in research as well. And then analyzing it, there's lots and lots written about this by many smart people. But in general, understanding observer bias, we all know that humans are contributing these data, and so understanding how humans contribute to how they're motivated, why they're contributing to iNaturalist, and accounting for that when necessary in statistical models is really, really important. It's presence-only data, and so inferring absences is really difficult to do unless you think about some hardcore modeling, and this field is like a growing field that's thinking and working on this. And then, filtering the data to match the research objective and the scale of inference. Thinking about how you do that is really important to make sure your inferences from iNaturalist are robust. And then the last thing, again, this is really important because iNaturalist data it is a living, dynamically changing data set, infrastructure, ecosystem online. And so versioning and making sure that your data and code are reproducible so that 5, 10 years from now, when iNaturalist is 3, 4, 5 times the size, but you had this little piece. Well, can we repeat that study and get those same inferences, or do our inferences change? And so, I'm very pro open science, and I think it's really important to think about how you make the research that you do with iNaturalist reproducible. The other thing I'll say is a lot of people contribute to a citizen science and iNaturalist because they think it, contributes to science and conservation. So making sure you try to push for open access publications and having that kind of out there in the public so anybody can go look at it and understand what you did, I think is a really important point when it comes to iNaturalist data usage. And this is my last slide. I will leave you with this, but um, right, 85,000 observations per day so far this year. We have way more data than we've ever known what to do with. But I try to spend my time thinking about here, right? Like this is only going to keep increasing. I showed you the increase in number of iNaturalist observations through time. So what can we do now, or what can we study now? And like what fundamental research questions need to take place now so that 5, 10, 20 years from now, these data are automatically integrated into policy, environmental review, conservation, and biodiversity research at large. And yeah, I'll end there. And so thank you very much for your time.